I want to welcome everyone to the First Parish in Bedford Unitarian Universalist Lyceum, which today is being proudly presented in conjunction with the First Parish in Bedford's Peace and Justice Committee. And our speaker today will be Dr. Alice Rothschild. I wanted to first hand this off to my colleague, Joe Pompey, and explain the significance of this presentation in terms of its topic. So Joe, you want to take it away?
Sure. Welcome everybody. And this afternoon's Lyceum is dedicated to Dave and Ginny Packer, both of whom sadly passed away within 17 days of each other last July. Dave and Jenny were longtime social justice warriors. They were involved in all kinds of justice programming here at First Parish before I became a member 20 years ago. Several years ago, Dave and Jenny, along with Brown Pulliam, another member of our First Parish community, traveled to Palestine in a boots on the ground fact-finding tour. Their goal was to experience firsthand what daily life was like in the occupied territories. All three returned changed people. All three came back committed to sharing stories of the human rights abuses as told to them by the Palestinians they met on their trip. What they witnessed with their ears, their eyes, and their hearts turned them into advocates for basic Palestinian human rights. Dave especially was responsible for coordinating future trips to Palestine, allowing additional First Parish parishioners to make that same tour. He lobbied our Peace and Justice Committee, along with our Social Responsibility Council, to provide scholarships for more travel to Palestine. Dave was able to bring several influential speakers to First Parish, including Dr. Rothchild. I believe this is Alice's second and maybe even third visit here since 2010. So today we honor Dave and Jenny's tireless work and dedication to bring awareness of the reality of human rights abuses, which continue to be experienced by Palestinians even as we sit here this afternoon. If not for Dave and Jenny and their work, chances are we would not be gathered here today in this place, continuing to learn more about the struggles for peace and justice in Palestine and Israel. We thank Dave and Jenny.
Thank you, Joe. So let me introduce Dr. Rothchild, a few comments and background. Dr. Rothchild is a physician, author, and filmmaker who for the last 25 years has focused much of her attention and interest on human rights and social justice surrounding the Israel-Palestine conflict. She practiced obstetrics and gynecology for almost 40 years and was assistant professor of OBGYN at Harvard Medical School until 2014. Alice currently lives in Seattle, Washington with her husband, but was born here in Boston. And she developed an interest in progressive politics in the 1960s and 70s, starting with campus opposition to the Vietnam War, and her later discovery of feminism and health reform movements while in medical school and residency. She contributed to the first edition of Our Body, Ourselves, became increasingly active in a number of social justice organizations, and began speaking and writing on topics ranging from childbirth to menopause to caring for underserved populations. Since 1997, Alice turned much of her non-medical focus to understanding and writing about Israeli-Palestinian conflict, its relationship to US foreign policy, and American Jewry. She worked with a number of local and national groups and is on the board of We Are Not Numbers program in Gaza and the Gaza Mental Health Foundation, as well as on the steering committee of the Jewish Voice for Peace Health Advisory Council. Her publications related to the Israel-Palestine conflict include Broken Dreams, Stories of Jewish and Palestinian Trauma and Resilience, On the Brink, Israel and Palestine on the Eve of the 2014 Gaza Invasion, and Condition Critical, Life and Death in Israel-Palestine. Alice has also directed the award-winning documentary film called Voices Across the Divide. Dr. Rothchild writes and lectures widely, blogs regularly, and currently is working on books for young adults and children, including a young adult novel and a young adult memoir in verse. Please welcome Dr. Alice Rothchild.
Thank you so much. It's a great honor to be giving a talk in honor of Ginny and David, who I also got to know. So I'm going to be looking at Jerusalem as a microcosm of the realities in Israel-Palestine and occupation. And I'm going to be focusing on East Jerusalem and the surrounding areas of Greater Jerusalem, which have experienced decades of Judaization and attempts to erase the Palestinian presence. I'm going to ask, what are the costs of these policies, not only to Palestinians, but also to Jewish Israelis who are claiming this city as their own? And how is this a mirror of the ongoing occupation in Palestine? And what can we learn and what can we do about it? So very briefly, a bit of history about me. I started out as a nice Jewish girl born in 1948, which, as you know, was a very important year, growing up in the Boston area. I went to Hebrew school 3 times a week, went to services every Saturday morning. We celebrated Jewish holidays, including Passover, which is coming up soon. And you know, the Seder ends with the song, Next Year in Jerusalem. And when I was a young teenager, my family made a pilgrimage to Israel. So I was really grounded in an awareness of the centrality of Jerusalem, a city founded some 3,000 years ago by King David. And I understood that Jerusalem has a religious and historical significance. And this has also merged with a deep sense of holiness and yearning for Jews all over the world. I also embraced my status as a member of a long-hated minority and a child of politically progressive family. I honored the heritage of Jews who had defended the disenfranchised in the civil rights movement, the women's movement, the labor movement, and even with the state of Israel, the ingathering of Jewish people, the light unto the nations. I was intensely proud of that state. For me, as I started to be Jewish, not only meant to be an outsider and a survivor, but also to be chosen, not just in the biblical sense, but also to be responsible for making the world a more just place. So I loved Israel uncritically, and I saw the Israeli Defense Force as kind of a platonic ideal of an army. It was moral, invincible, principled, and most surprisingly, Jewish. And this was the new Jew, not the nebbish Torah scholar from Eastern Europe, lamb to the slaughter kind of Jew, but a proud, muscular, usually tan and handsome kind of Jew. In 1964, when my family made its first trip to Israel, I recorded the trip in a diary that's like brimming with a million observations as well as teenage angst, but also loaded with negative assumptions about Arabs. Driving into the city, I wrote about Arabs, quote, in their dirty headdresses and the ancient terraces built in the days of old, with no understanding of who exactly had been tending those gnarled grapevines and olive trees all these centuries of old. And I wrote in my diary, quote, as we entered Jerusalem, it seemed like we were going into a city less of the present than the past. We reviewed the Jordanian border and spied on the Arab half of Jerusalem. Everywhere were the marks of war, bullet holes, barbed wire, sentry posts. Then we went to the tomb of King David. Here, each religion had added its piece, leaving a vivid picture of history in the buildings. From the top of a minaret, we examined the old city, where the only traces of life were the lines of laundry. 40 years later, I returned as a student of history and as a political and human rights activist, trying to make sense of this deeply fractured city. Since then, I've immersed myself in examining the price of the triumphal Jewish narrative of return and unification, and the consequences of a perceived eternal Jewish victimhood, which gave birth to the belief that historic Palestine was ours at any cost. I grew to understand the blindness of otherwise decent, liberal-minded Jewish Israelis, unable to see Palestinians as fellow human beings, equally deserving, brutally displaced in 1948 and again in 1967. My journey included interviewing, working with, and visiting many Palestinians living in East Jerusalem, West Bank, Gaza, detailing their experiences in essays, books, and a documentary film. I placed my perceptions of Jerusalem in the context of my developing understanding of the history of the founding of the state, which contradicted many of the myths that I grew up with at home and in Hebrew school, very parallel to the re-education of US history that I also was undergoing. I learned that the Zionist movement established an exclusive Jewish state in historic Palestine through a confluence of factors. These included European anti-Semitism, the Christian Zionism of colonial British leaders, the appalling consequences of the Nazi Holocaust, and the UN's attempts to address the desperate needs of post-war European Jewry who were not welcomed in other countries. And it's important to remember that the UN envisioned Jerusalem to be a shared city amongst the three Abrahamic religions. The underlying racism that allowed European trauma, aspirations, and history to be privileged at the expense of the indigenous Jewish Palestinian population was rarely acknowledged, or else it was acknowledged but justified in the name of Jewish survival. We were victims, we can do whatever it takes, and no one has the right to criticize. At the same time, I came to realize that much like societies colonized in other parts of the world, the people who were living in historic Palestine, Muslims, Christians, and a small number of Jews, could not be expected to peacefully relinquish their land and homes that they had lived in for centuries. Zionism was sold to me as a redemptive Jewish liberation movement, building a new and just society for my battered people in an ancestral land. Religious Jews yearned for the Messiah. Christian Zionists were awaiting the rapture. Both belief systems required Jews to return, although for very opposite reasons. In the maelstrom of all these political forces, Muslim and Christian Palestinians were rendered virtually invisible, often defined as implacable enemies or Arab terrorists. This is the context in which I came to understand Jerusalem. Over the years exploring the city, I found a montage of stunning contrasts, new and old, West and East, Christian, Muslim, and Jewish, where the layers of history were clearly apparent. Every occupier making claim, building homes, markets, temples, churches, mosques, often on top of each other or repurposing previous structures. And let's be real, the list of occupiers is long. Alexander the Great, Saladin, Pompey, Herod, the Persians, the Mongols, General Allenby. The extraordinary richness, beauty, and complexity of this place led me to be haunted by three questions. The first question is, why do Jewish Israeli claims take precedence over everyone else who has inhabited this city? Why do the needs and demands of Jews who have emigrated from Warsaw, Poland, or Brooklyn, New York, negate the claims of families who've actually lived in the city for centuries? And what is the price of these policies for Jewish Israelis as well as Palestinians? So I'm going to start out with a story which was part of my own transformation. It's 2011, and I'm meeting Abu Hassan in front of the Jerusalem Hotel for a walking bus tour of the city. And he explains that in 1967, when Israeli forces captured East Jerusalem from Jordan, there were 68,000 Palestinians living in East Jerusalem. They became residents of the city, not citizens of Israel. And the reason for that is after the war, they refused to accept Israeli citizenship because that would have negated their political rights to the city they once fully inhabited. And many of them had fled West Jerusalem in 1948. And the language here is confusing. And I want to clarify that in 1967, Israel created a greatly expanded East Jerusalem out of lands taken from 28 Palestinian towns and villages in the West Bank. And although the new East Jerusalem was 10 times larger than it had been, the idea was that these vast numbers of lands could be incorporated into Jerusalem, and they would be for exclusive Jewish use only. This was in order to what's called Judaize the city. The Israeli planning authorities drew tight lines around the already built up Palestinian neighborhoods and villages, declaring all the unbuilt land which had been used for agriculture or grazing and was the only space in which the future Palestinian population could expand. This was now called open green space. It meant that Palestinians might have owned the land, but they could not build on it. And since it was reserved for future urban development, it was only reserved for future Jewish development. And the land, thus left unused, could easily be expropriated for Jewish settlements. So what does that mean? 40% of the land has been confiscated as military zones or green space, which was then developed for Jewish settlements. And at this point, Palestinians make up 40% of the Jerusalem population, and they have access to between 7 and 8% of the land. And for Palestinians in East Jerusalem to retain their residency IDs, they have to repeatedly prove they live within the Jerusalem borders. So Israeli authorities repeatedly check bill paying and rent payments to document that these folks are actually living there. In 2005, the Israeli government stopped all residency applications. This caused a host of problems because the Israeli government opposed the policy of family reunification. So what that means is that if an East Jerusalemite man, for instance, marries a West Bank woman, she cannot legally live with him. And if he moves to the West Bank to live with her, he will not be allowed to return to East Jerusalem. So Abu Hassan explained to us that there are hundreds and hundreds of Palestinian families who have what are called weekend relationships, with each partner retaining residency in their place of origin, shuttling themselves and their growing families back and forth. And I know someone who's did that for years, or living illegally in Jerusalem without access to services and with constant fear of deportation. And East Jerusalemites who travel abroad for work or education are at risk for losing their IDs due to often obscure and changing regulations and a strangling bureaucracy. And I know people who've experienced that as well. But going back to this tour, Abu Hassan's family had lived in Jerusalem for generations. He had an uncle that lived in the neighborhood of Abu Dis. In 1967, the Israeli government declared that his section of the community was now part of the West Bank. So poof, he lost his East Jerusalem ID and has been unable to return to the city. Abu Hassan explained also that the erasure of the Palestinian presence continued with the building of a bridge and a tram so that Jewish settlers could avoid traveling through Palestinian areas and avoid contact with Palestinian people. Abu Hassan pointed out to us the settlement of Pisgot, which was established in 1979 and is now one of the biggest Jewish colonies in East Jerusalem, built on the land of the Palestinian villages of Shuafat and Beit Hanina. Over time, Pisgot has expanded its landmass 4.5 times, using more land that was part of El Biera, a Palestinian city north of Jerusalem. And then Abu Hassan showed us the separation wall or Apartheid Wall near Pisgot, and it has surrounded Palestinian villages and the Shuafat refugee camp. So there were 60,000 refugees with an entrance exit that they needed to have an East Jerusalem ID to pass. So in this bizarre world, with 20% of the inhabitants of the camp within this curve of the wall, they had West Bank IDs and they were married to East Jerusalemites. So they basically had two options: stay on the camp side of the wall or move to the West Bank. Abu Hassan also reminded us that East Jerusalemites paid the same taxes as West Jerusalemites, but received 10 to 20% of the public services. And you can see this if you're in the Old City. The Jewish quarter of the Old City is clean and well kept, as opposed to the grime, garbage, and disrepair often seen in the Arab sector. Abu Hassan pointed out to us the rooftops. Jewish houses had white water towers for hot water. Palestinian houses had white towers, but also black towers because their water supply was not reliable. And additional water storage was done when it was available. In addition, Palestinians paid 5 times as much for this precious commodity compared to Jews. East Jerusalemites were also similarly disadvantaged when it came to electricity or obtaining permits to expand or build homes, which continues to be virtually impossible to get. They're disadvantaged in social services, protection by the police, infrastructure like sewage systems and trash collection. To drive this point home, he took us into the Jewish settlement of Piscot, with rows of neat, well-groomed apartments, a mall, a good transportation system, modern local services, a playground, a swimming pool. And by contrast, nearby Palestinians were faced with severe shortages of schools. And he said for the last 2 years, there were actually 150 Palestinian children who'd been unable to find schooling. The catch-22 about this is that when the child turns 16 and applies for an official East Jerusalem residency ID, the parents have to prove that the child attended school within the Jerusalem borders by providing a yearly diploma and documentation that both parents were from East Jerusalem. Now, this kind of bureaucratic torture is very much characteristic of Palestinian life. Abu Hassan explained that he had married a German woman, and he struggled for 12 years to get her a residency ID. And during that time, she was not allowed to leave the country or work, and thus had no health insurance. And after the first 5 years, the residency laws changed, and he had to start the process all over again. So he had spent $15,000 in lawyers' fees, but now he was finally assured that his 4 children would be able to get their IDs. By contrast, Jews are encouraged by Israel to buy apartments, often at 1/3 the market value with reduced tax collection. He then took us past a cascade of gray houses, the Shuafat refugee camp, established in 1967 after the war, when families who'd lived in Jerusalem for generations were removed by the Israeli military from the area that's just adjacent to the Western Wall. So at that point in 67, there were 3,400 people. By 2011, there were between 60 and 80,000 people, and they were crowded into 1 square kilometer of camp. And the usual story, they started living in tents, then UNRWA, the UN relief, the United Nations Relief and Works Agency provided the tents and then the concrete houses, and now they were expanding vertically. The camp was surrounded by high concrete walls, but from the upper stories of their apartments, refugees could easily see the well-maintained Jewish settlements, the land confiscation, the green lawns and swimming pools. Many of the citizens of Piscot were from Brooklyn, Kahanas famous for their violent racism. Abu Hassan reported that there was now a Jewish Defense League that waited for Palestinian youth at the mall to attack them, unrestrained by the Israeli police. We then arrived at Sheikh Jarrah, a neighborhood which is still in the news, and stood in front of the house of the evicted Al-Khawi family, who I had actually met the previous year living in a tent outside their own home. In 2009, 800 soldiers and police evicted 37 members of this family from their homes. And while we were there, we watched a man with a large black hat and long black coat rush to their apartment, which was now topped with a gigantic menorah. The Palestinian family still receives the water and electricity bills as they refuse to change the registration. We then visited an elderly Palestinian woman who had been evicted from her home where she had lived for many decades with her family, and she had extended the 1-story building to accommodate the growing children and grandchildren. Now, during a recent eviction, Jewish settlers were moved into the front portion of her home, which was now draped with this large Israeli flag, and they had painted Stars of David around the front window. This poor woman was forced to live in the back portion with her son and grandchildren. Their case was now in the Israeli courts, where there was little chance that they would be viewed favorably. And at any time, this family, like others in the neighborhood, could be evicted forcibly and put out on the street with their meager possessions. Suddenly, a friend of Abu Hassan's came rushing up and showed him a photo on his phone. We were informed that a demolition was underway. Abu Hassan explained that the former house of the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem, which then became a hotel, which then became a center for the Shin Bet, Israel's internal security agency, was being demolished in order to build 500 homes for Jewish settlers. We hustled back into the bus and drove to the area, which was crowded with cars and press. There were large yellow Volvo bulldozers that we could see smashing at the walls of this old house, creating clouds of debris. A crowd of reporters, cameramen, and angry protesters gathered. An older woman with a purple hijab spoke, gesturing animatedly to a white-haired man, who we later found out was Elisha Peleg, a member of the city council. The general tone of this crowd was frustration and rage, and yet another land grab in East Jerusalem, another violation of international law, another nail in the coffin of a future Palestinian state. Peleg was arguing that the demolition was legal and he was citing various administrative procedures. And then he said, "We have a right to have Jewish families in this unified city. I am very proud of what we are doing." Then he said Arabs could easily get permits in West Jerusalem, which is totally false. And then he accused the protesters of racism. He angrily questioned if any Arabs had papers to prove that they were evicted from properties in Jerusalem and had gone through the appropriate channels, et cetera, et cetera. And then a whole bunch of very angry, hostile Arab men clearly stated that they had had personal experiences with this and with dispossession and were quite familiar with the antagonistic Israeli permitting and court systems. People started chanting, "Shame, shame, shame." And I noticed thug-like, heavily armed security guards in civilian clothes moving closer. At one point, a woman yelled at him, "You are delusional." He looked at her and said, "What is delusional?" Abu Hassan explained that his conflict was not with Jews. In fact, his family took care of an Iraqi Jewish woman for years in their own home. His conflict was with Zionists, who wanted to push Palestinians off the land they had called their own for generations. East Jerusalem was one of the battlegrounds, and the Palestinians were losing in the face of Byzantine administrative rules, outright lying, brutal violence, a society that had grown increasingly racist and supportive of right-wing ideologies, and an international community that had completely abdicated its responsibilities. To see the violations of international law and the Judaization of East Jerusalem happening in real time, surrounded by the people who were watching the Israeli government irreversibly colonize their land, which the international community recognized as occupied territory, was a sobering and emotional experience for me. Now, I found out that these demolitions occur within a context. I found that in the late 1990s and early 2000s, the Israeli government had produced a multi-volume master plan with thousands of pages devoted to the future of Jerusalem. The goal was to control Palestinian demographics and to increase the Jewish presence in the city. Through a combination of Judaization and ethnic cleansing, a gradual process of colonization, displacement, and dispossession, the intention was to decrease the Palestinian population. With almost scientific precision, that is what has been unfolding over the past 2 decades. Since 1967, no new Palestinian neighborhoods have been established in the city, while Jewish settlements surrounding existing Palestinian areas have mushroomed. Now, how does the Israeli government do this? The first method is through very restrictive zoning, which prevents Palestinians from building legally. So the Israeli government designated about half of the land in East Jerusalem as unavailable for development, a little over a third for Jewish settlements, leaving the Palestinian population with about 13%, most of which was already built on. Those with growing families are forced to choose between building illegally or leaving the city, which means roughly 1/3 of them have decided to build, which means that there are some 93,000 residents who are under constant threat of home demolishment. So think about what it is like to live like that. The next method is through the separation or Apartheid Wall. The construction of this wall is supposed to cut Jerusalemites off from the West Bank, but it also cuts Jerusalemites off from each other. The route of the wall was chosen to encompass as many East Jerusalem and West Bank Jewish settlements on the Israel side as possible, while excluding the largest possible number of Palestinians. And the wall divides Palestinians into 2 groups. Around 3/4 found themselves on the Israeli side, and about 1/4 found themselves on the West Bank side, and are now forced to wait in long lines at checkpoints to get to school or to services. And some smaller Palestinian villages in the Jerusalem area are completely encircled by the wall, completely ghettoized. Now, since that tour, I have found that there are now 3 master plans for Jerusalem. And some of the goals of these plans include to shape the city into a center for Jewish tourism, a center for high-tech and biotech industries, a center for higher education, and to use urban planning to reshape the city's demography. And that is a critical point. And I was visiting a group, I've visited them a number of times, called Stop the Wall. And they outlined other plans that the Israeli government had, which are clearly outlined and stated. First, Israel planned to expand the boundaries of Greater Jerusalem to include Jewish settlement blocks, which they did, and surround them with the imposing separation wall, which snakes into the West Bank and ghettoizes local Palestinians, which they did. 22 villages with over 200,000 people, once part of Jerusalem, were to be located outside of the Holy City. Within the Holy City, the changes started with the destruction of the neighborhood along the Wailing Wall, which I had mentioned, and then the allotment of millions of shekels to Judaize the area, displacing some 50,000 residents of Silwan, which is now officially called the City of David. And the Israeli government moves in Jewish families, house by house by house. The final step was the establishment of a highly politicized and extremely criticized archaeological excavation in the City of David. And this excavation is designed to prove Jewish exclusivity to a city that has been occupied innumerable times over thousands of years by many different occupiers, and displacing 1,500 Palestinians to make space for a parking lot. The Israelis planned to continue a similar process in the neighborhoods of Shuafat and Sheikh Jarrah, and then to link them all together with the light rail that ends at the Damascus Gate, gradually eliminating the presence of Palestinians. I learned of plans for multiple well-funded new projects, museums, hotels, tunnels under ancient walls, car parks, tourist overviews, new synagogues, including one that was supposed to be built just outside the wall of the old city. And the goal, again, is for Israel to control the land and the narrative. Jerusalem as a Jewish city, making Palestinian life as restricted and Palestinian tourism as difficult as possible. And East Jerusalem would become increasingly isolated from the West Bank, increasingly difficult to live and work in, and hopefully, according to the Israeli government, the Palestinians will leave. So this is a form of both active and passive transfer. The result of all this is a poverty rate of over 75% for Palestinians in East Jerusalem, and that was just a couple of years ago, so it's probably higher. In addition, there's a growing identity crisis in East Jerusalem, particularly amongst the youth, because they're so isolated from the occupied territories. Also, there's been a leadership and institutional vacuum and a loss of hope in the possibilities of positive change. So we see Israeli Jewish communities growing through horizontal expansion and new settlements, and Palestinian communities growing through densification and vertical expansion. And the master plans, again, are using political plans that use urban planning as a tool to ensure Jewish demographic and territorial control. The plans also support what they call spatial segregation of the various groups. There are other examples of bureaucratic torture. 7% of the building permits in Jerusalem were issued to Palestinians, who are 40% of the population. And not only is there tremendous discrimination in issuing these permits, they cost a lot of money, approximately $30,000, which most Palestinian families do not have and are forced to build illegally. Another example is that Palestinians cannot claim the properties they lost in 48 or 67 in what is now West Jerusalem. The Israeli Supreme Court always rules in favor of Jewish Israeli settler claims to, quote, win back homes. And these homes were given to the Palestinians by the United Nations, who had fled West Jerusalem and in 1948, in exchange for their giving up their right of return. And they have papers to prove this, which do not stand up in Israeli courts. Another example of bureaucratic torture is a very controversial and dangerous law called the Third Generation Law, which targets properties that were rented before 68 and that are supposed to be protected by law. And based on this new law, the protection period ends with the death of the third generation of Palestinian tenants, after which the property goes back to its original owner, who are mainly Jews who owned the property before 1948. There are many other examples. Since 2001, Israel has closed at least 31 Palestinian institutions, including the Orient House, the former headquarters of the PLO, the Chamber of Commerce and Industry. Even the Government of Jerusalem and the Ministry of Jerusalem Affairs are prohibited from working in Jerusalem and are forced to operate out of a building in Al-Ram, which lies in the northeast corner of Jerusalem. And so this is the reality of East Jerusalem, and it has many real life consequences, as you can see. And I want to just talk about a very recent real life consequence, and that has been the response to the COVID-19 pandemic. Now, I have been curating a timeline that comes out mostly weekly on the pandemic in Israel-Palestine. And so I have collected a huge amount of data. So we have in East Jerusalem now about 350,000 people who do have access to tertiary care level care in the high-level Palestinian hospitals in East Jerusalem, as well as to the Israeli medical care system. But despite this fact, this population has been chronically ignored and under-resourced on the ground. So first of all, just to get the data has been hard. I can never tell whether East Jerusalem data is mished into the Israel data, or is it in the West Bank data or the occupied territories data? And I think it pretty much depends on who is doing the reporting. And it's also important to remember that East Jerusalem is not covered by the Palestinian Ministry of Health. So they'll make statements and I have no idea if they're talking about East Jerusalem as well. When the pandemic hit, all the public health information that Israel put out came out in Hebrew. And it took a lot of agitating to get information in Arabic to be accessible to the Arab-speaking population. And much like Area C, which is the 65% of the West Bank that is under total control and where most of the settlers live, the Israelis just literally destroyed COVID-19 clinics set up by the PA, either in East Jerusalem or Area C, and actually knocked them down. They prohibited testing. Even when the UN brought protective kits, they were obstructed by the Israeli forces. And this is a clear form of medical apartheid. So not surprisingly, the vaccination rates in East Jerusalem lagged way behind the rates in West Jerusalem. They also even lag behind the rates of the Harari, who are the Orthodox Jews who don't have much exposure to science, and they were way behind. East Jerusalemite Palestinians were behind Arab villages in Israel. And this is all due to less screening, less resources, less education, less publications in Arabic. And then, if you think of the tens of thousands of East Jerusalemite Palestinians who do not have coverage from the Ministry of Health, who live beyond the wall, they have to go through checkpoints, and usually the Kalandia checkpoint, which is a horrible choke point, in order to be vaccinated. And then on top of that, Palestinian social media was rife with coronavirus denial and anti-vaccine conspiracy theories, much like in communities of color in the United States. The messaging being, don't trust information from the oppressor. So it's also important to remember that through this pandemic, the occupation continued. People are told to shelter at home, wash their hands, wear masks. Meanwhile, the Israelis are doing home demolitions. They're expelling people from Sheikh Jarrah. Shootings continue. There's not enough water. Police raids continue. And that continued unabated during the pandemic. And it's not surprising, as the current pandemic wave is decreasing. Last month, most new cases in the occupied territories were in East Jerusalem. So there are life and death consequences to the realities of living in East Jerusalem. So I'm going to end with two more comments, and because there's just so much to talk about, but these are two recent things that have come to the forefront. And perhaps you've heard of the NSO Group Technology Spyware Group. They make Pegasus, which is a spyware that is what's called touch-free. In other words, it can sneak into your iPhone without you touching a button at all. It just gets in there with their magic spying. And what they have done with this is intense surveillance of the Palestinian population, including East Jerusalem. And there's also something called the Blue Wolf and White Wolf initiatives, which is an extensive network of technology that's used both by Israeli soldiers and settlers to collect and record photos of Palestinians that are fed into a massive facial recognition database. Another article recently came out that all phones imported into Gaza are implanted with an Israeli military software bug, and that Israel's entire security apparatus can listen to every single phone call Palestinians are making in the occupied territories. So this is a highly surveilled group. The other big thing that happened, and this was about 7 months ago, is that Israel named 6 Palestinian human rights groups as terror organizations. And this is part of a whole ongoing program to destroy them. And what we know is that the criminalization of those who are opposing authoritarian regimes and calling them terrorists, and the expansion of the meaning of terrorism to include people who are speaking out against the very repression that is the problem, is a known strategy of authoritarians worldwide. And now, while the Israeli government acts with impunity, it is moving in a very dangerous direction. And as we see, as I keep saying, none of this happens by accident. The future of Jerusalem will clearly be built by the steady march of Israeli bulldozers, by the pounding of construction projects, and the whine of tear gas and bullets. Jerusalem is a microcosm of Israeli policy and reality. And with human rights organizations being attacked, how will we know what's happening on the ground? Now, when I hear of efforts by Jewish extremists to pray at Haram al-Sharif, the Temple Mount, in the shadows of Al-Aqsa Mosque and the Dome of the Rock, or to construct another Jewish temple on the site, I am just filled with grief. And when I hear of Israeli government plans to build on top of a Muslim cemetery, which they do, or extend, this just happened recently, the Jerusalem walls of the National Park to include the Mount of Olives, violating property rights of private properties that are owned by Palestinians, Franciscan, Armenian, and Greek Orthodox churches, it just fills me with anger. When another family in Sheikh Jarrah is thrown into the street, another Palestinian boy is shot by a soldier or a settler, another archaeological site is developed by Elad, the tourist and archaeology settler organization, or Ateret Kohanim, which seeks to create a Jewish majority in the old city and in Palestinian neighborhoods in East Jerusalem, all to promote a nationalistic, ideologic agenda. I can only shake my head in despair. When thousands of men in kippahs, wrapped in blue and white Israeli flags, march defiantly in the annual Jerusalem Day parade, chanting "Death to Arabs," or a Palestinian family self-demolishes their home to avoid paying huge fines, I feel ashamed to be a Jew. Jerusalem is a vivid example of the failure of Zionism, the cost of a supremacist Jewish ideology that demonizes Muslims and Christians and people identified as Arab, and allows a thuggish right-wing element of the population to flower. In Jerusalem, I feel the loss of the prophetic traditions that have been central to Judaism as a religion and Jewish culture. I see the demise of the decency and tolerance in a historic city that could have been shared amongst three Abrahamic faiths and might have been an example for the rest of the world. Instead, this city with so much potential has been lost to a righteous, racist settler colonial state. Now, there is so much to be done as we move forward. What can we do? The first thing I think is it's very important to stay educated. It is really easy now to know what's going on. Read Mondoweiss, read Plus 972 that comes out of Israel, read Al Jazeera, read Palestine Chronicle. There are think tanks like Al Shabaka. There's podcasts. It is very easy to stay on top of this and to challenge the dominant narrative, which is that Israel's a liberal democracy. It's the villa in the jungle. We need to educate our communities and to compete and keep Palestine in the spotlight, even as we face a virtual tsunami of catastrophes from Ukraine and Syria, Yemen and South Sudan. It is pretty overwhelming to be alive these days. But there are websites, there is reports, there are films, novels, history books, social media. Palestinians locally and internationally are taking control of their narrative, and we need to listen. I often hear people say, well, we need to give Palestinians a voice. Palestinians have a voice. What they need from us is a microphone. And I think it's very important not to be afraid of the accusation of anti-Semitism. Israel, I will remind you, is a country. Zionism is a political movement, not the litmus test for being a Jew. Judaism is a religion and a culture, and Jews are a very diverse group of people. In a democratic society, criticizing countries and political movements and the behaviors of people is different from hating an identified group solely because they are part of that group. The other thing we should be doing is intersectional work around racism, militarism, Islamophobia, police brutality, not just Palestine. Do not exceptionalize Israel or Palestine. Palestinian solidarity work is part of a global struggle against colonialism and bigotry and militarism. And it's important to support the boycott, divestment, and sanction movement. It was fascinating to watch the response to the attack on Ukraine because it gives us a window into the power of a unified international condemnation of the behavior of a country and the power of boycott. And it's also important to see the underlying racism that such a response only comes in the defense of what some journalists have called civilized white Europeans like us. Not good. And we have to keep pressuring our elected representatives. We have Rashida Tlaib and the squad and other sympathetic Congresspeople who've given us a window of opportunity. We have Betty McCollum's bills that come up every year. The conversation is changing. It's changing at a snail's pace, but it is definitely changing. And I think it's really important to remember the idea that there are two equally weighted sides to a story when it comes to Palestine ignores the power imbalance between the settler colonial state and the colonized, and is thus a form of epistemicide, the destruction of knowledge of Palestinian realities. It's not good for Palestinians, but it's also not good for our Jewish Israeli sisters and brothers and folks in between, who are deeply corrupted by this behavior and ideology. So we must work against the narrative of the powerful, where the exceptionalism of Israel is seen as normative and defining, and we must uplift the voices for justice. And I'm just going to end with this final thought. People always say, well, the arc of history bends towards justice, but it only bends in that direction if we choose to bend it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Rothchild. We'll now open the presentation to question and answer period. And if you're interested in speaking, if you are on a computer that has the reaction button, please raise your hand that way, or raise your hand in the participant view. Or if you want to wildly wave your hand, we'll try to identify you and unmute you. So I'll help you, Paul, if you can go through whom is waving their hand on visually, and I will look on the participant list.
I'll look, but pressing the reaction raise hand button is a much easier way to get attention.
Okay, very good. Thank you. And before we continue with the Q&A, there are some comments in the chat. If people are interested in getting in contact with you, Alice, is it acceptable to go to your website?
Sure, I can put my email in the chat.
That would be wonderful.
If you would get to, if you went to my website.
Yeah. And there are a few people asking if you have the script for your talk and you'd be willing to share it. I know that you give talks all the time, so it might not be appropriate. So
yeah, I do have the notes. I'll tell you a story. I was asked a couple of months ago. I got this email out of the blue from a rabbi in New Jersey asking me if I would write an essay about Jerusalem for a book that he's putting together. He works with a group called the Jerusalem Peace Institute, and they had put together a book, Muslim Reflections on Jerusalem, and then they put together a book, Christian Reflections on Jerusalem, and now they were putting together a book, Jewish Reflections. And, at first I thought this was a joke because rabbis don't generally write to me. But I did talk with him and it seemed all for real. And so I wrote an essay that's based on this talk. And, he said, I know you're to the left of me and blah, blah, blah. But he felt like my voice was important in this book. I have not heard from him since I sent him the essay. And I have no idea what that means, whether this was a hoax or whether it's for real or whether he feels like he can't put an essay like that in his book. I have no idea. So I would like to wait and see if this book actually comes out before sharing. But, you know, it's going to be available. The talk is available on recording.
Thank you. And your website has some information on your bio.
Yeah.
I wanted to just share that with you, and it's www.alicerothchild, spelled ROTHCHILD.com. Okay, so if you can raise your hand with the reactions and also the participant hand, let's go through those first. I see Zoom the Nutzer. If you want to unmute yourself.
As you said it in German, I'm afraid that's me. My name is Ina. Hello.
Okay, thank you. I'm sorry I messed up your name.
I'm sorry that I didn't put my right name in on the screen. I'll change that. Thank you very, very, very much for organizing this and yeah, for sharing this bunch of information with us. My question is, and that might sound a bit naive, but what is your strategy? I mean, after the 100 years of asymmetry and powers, where do you think is the level? Where would you start a political strategy or a civil society movement in order to shift or to, yeah, realize a kind of transformation in this process?
Okay, well, you know, that is the big question, obviously.
Yeah.
And when I started this work, I was mostly focused on, you know, we have to pressure the US government to force Israel to end the occupation. And that was the main focus of most work at that point, and also to figure out what was going on. At this point, my main focus is to understand the Palestinian movement that has grown up over the decades and what people are calling for. And the national movement is calling for, you know, boycott, divestment, and sanction, which is aimed at pressuring Israel to behave in a more just fashion. And that includes the fact that Israeli citizens who are Palestinian are not treated, they're second-class citizens. They don't get what Jewish citizens get as a rule. You know, 97% of the land in Israel is reserved, 93% of the land in Israel is reserved solely for Jews. I mean, there are a lot of, you know, there's the nation state bill, which says that the only group that has the right to self-determination in Israel are Jews. There's all this kind of stuff that clearly puts Palestinians with Israeli citizenship at a deficit. So that needs to be resolved. The occupation needs to end, and there needs to be a resolution of the refugees that are now living all over the world. So I see this as a human rights struggle. I don't have any idea how it's going to turn out. There are people who are two-staters. I don't have any belief that the two-state solution could work at this point because so much of the West Bank has been taken over by settlements. There are people that are in favor of a secular democratic state. There are people that are in favor of federations. I don't think we're at that place. What we're doing right now is working on a human rights struggle. And the thing that I find interesting is that over the decades, the conversation has changed. I mean, when I started this work in '97, we spent a year debating whether we could say the word Palestine in our talks. And if those of you can remember when Jimmy Carter published his book, Peace, Not Apartheid, everybody had a conniption because he used the word apartheid. Recently, the UN, Amnesty International, you know, a whole bunch of human rights organizations came out and said, you know, this is apartheid. So this is a anti-apartheid struggle. It's a human rights struggle. And it's a human rights struggle for everyone. I mean, Israeli Jews are going to live in Israel. Fine. That's a given. The question is, how is it going to be? And are they going to live in a state which is really undemocratic and racist and occupying a whole population? Or are they going to be pushed to have a more just solution? And it is very clear to me that no state, and that includes, you know, us, ever gives up power voluntarily. So the question is, how can the powerful state be pressured to move in a more just direction? And that's a many-pronged thing. You know, it's work in Congress, it's the BDS movement, it's global disapproval of the behavior of Israel. I don't know what form it's going to take, but I think that's what the struggle is. Now, it's also, you know, very clear that this is a very crazy part of the world, and there are a lot of other things going on. But for instance, looking, you know, everybody who talks about how wonderful the Abraham Accords are and how Israel's making peace with all these Arab nations. I mean, the underlying theme of that is that Israel has thrown the Arab nations that have these repressive regimes have been very willing to throw Palestinians under the bus in exchange for a huge amount of military hardware. And that's what the exchange is. So you have to ask yourself, is that going to make this region safer? Is that going to be good for Palestinians? Is it going to be good for Israelis? So these are the kind of issues that you have to keep pushing on and working on. But again, anti-apartheid and human rights struggle is the kind of work we have to do. And there are, you know, Israeli Jews that agree with this, and of course, many that don't.
Alice, just a follow-up to that, excuse me, pardon me, are there organizations that you might recommend people consider supporting that are specifically focusing on divestment, boycott, pinpointing the Palestinian situation?
Yeah, well, the main group I work with is Jewish Voice for Peace.
Thank you.
Which I think is very good. And also, you know, there's a website, I think it's boycott.net or bds.net. It's something like that, where you can see what's going on in the boycott world.
There's a question in the chat about how Hamas fits into this whole picture.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if you feel that that's related or not, but I just want to share
everything
that.
is related. So, you know, Hamas is like one of those things that is so complicated and contradictory, and you really have to think long and hard about how to talk about it. And the way I understand things, and I've been to Gaza 3 times, so I have a bit of a sense of what the place is like. That, you know, Hamas started out as an organization trying to make people into good Muslims, and it has a whole social service side of it, and they operate schools and orphanages and, you know, take care of people that are basically forgotten. They also have a whole militant wing that rose out of fighting the occupation. And so clearly I never ever support violence. I find the militant wing of Hamas's violence appalling. I find even more appalling the violence of the Israeli Defense Force. So in terms of doers that create havoc and death, the Israeli Defense Force wins for me over what Hamas does. The other thing is that Hamas has had is not a monolithic organization, and it has had very moderate leaders, it has had very extreme leaders, and the Israelis have systematically assassinated most of the moderate leadership. So Hamas has been pushed both politically and militarily to a more aggressive stand. Now, when I talk to Palestinians about this, you know, Hamas was elected to in an election a couple of years ago, that then it was like 2005 or 6, something like that. And then the entire world, led by Israel and the US, called for a blockade and a siege of Gaza. Now, many Palestinians say, look, I don't like Hamas any more than you do. And if you'd let us alone, we would have voted them out if they were not able to deliver what they had promised. But we've been never, you know, there's a strong belief in the democratic method and elections in Palestinian communities. We never got the opportunity to do that. And now there's this horrific fight between the Palestinian Authority and Hamas. And Palestinian Authority has become basically an arm of Israeli surveillance systems. They do a lot of the dirty work for the Israeli Defense Force, and they're a fairly corrupt organization. So the Palestinian politics is a mess. And most Palestinians I know think it's a mess. And also people will say, well, where's their Nelson Mandela? Well, there are plenty of Palestinian Nelson Mandelas that are sitting in prison. So it's a complicated situation. Hamas absolutely has to be taken into account, but they're not very popular. And they have not been able to deliver either on housing or food security or peace or anything. That, you know, Palestinians are very, very aware of that. But again, you have to negotiate with your enemy. So it's not like saying we are not going to talk to them is going to get things any closer. And I think you have to really be aware of the level of trauma and suffering that is going on in Gaza because of the siege, and the number of people that are food insecure and can't get health care and whose educations have been destroyed, et cetera, et cetera. That's not building friends for Israel. That's creating more desperate people who have less and less hope. So I think you have to negotiate.
Thank you.
Mohammed has raised his hand. You could unmute now.
Ellen, this is in response to your question. There is an organization, there are several actually, but one that comes to mind is American Muslims for Palestine.
Mhm.
And again, I say this not to take away anything that JVP has done. And JVP has and continues to do some wonderful work. So AMP is one organization. There are others as well that do advocacy work here in the United States for the support of Palestinians. So just a response to the question you asked.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And Skip Shield.
My question is about the old city.
Mhm.
Alice, you mentioned the possibility of a tram going up to the Damascus Gate, which is the entry point for the Muslim quarter of the old city. And you mentioned some plans. Are there any plans that include a takeover of more and more of the Muslim quarter of the old city?
I believe there are. I don't have the data in my hand, but the sort of Judaization of the old city happens on a microscopic level, house by house by house. I can't speak to the specifics, but that's the trend is, and that's what the plan is. And so I would suspect that that's, like in Silwan, it's just going step by step by step. I mean, the thing that always intrigues me is how the Israeli government fights the minutia. So for instance, I have a friend who's from East Jerusalem who lived in Beit Hanina. She wanted to get better. She was a doctor and she wanted to have a good residency. And she and her husband ended up in Australia where he could get work and she was in residency. And they would go back and forth and back and forth. So they were very carefully maintaining the rules about how often they had to be in their home in East Jerusalem. And when she got pregnant, she wanted her baby to have an East Jerusalem ID. So she went back to East Jerusalem again, had the baby there. And then when she tried to register the child to get East Jerusalemite papers, the Israelis government denied it. And her husband had to go back to Australia to keep working. And she actually spent 10 months living in East Jerusalem in their house, fighting this all the way to the Supreme Court. And ultimately, she never got the papers. So she went home, had the baby, and had a stateless child. So it's fought on that kind of minutia level, person by person by person.
Sherry,
Thank you. Do you see any other hands waving?
Sherry can
or-
unmute.
Okay, thank you.
Hi. I want to thank you for this fabulous talk and for all of your work, which is truly wonderful. It seems to me that what President Biden has done with respect to Russia is boycott, divestment, and sanctions. And now those three terms and practices have been introduced to the public. So the question is, how can we use that fact to say, okay, you think it's a good idea to boycott, divest from, and sanction Russia? How about Israeli oppression of Palestinians, which to me as a Jew is absolutely enraging.
So a lot of people are talking about that. And I think, we have to remember boycott, divestment, and sanction is a strategy in a struggle. And what this massive amount of global support in the Western world, not in the entire world, to have BDS against Russia has shown people that this is a strategy, and it's a strategy that can have some power to it. It has its limits, but it has some great power to it. And so it's not something in the past that, oh, those South Africans did that and the grape workers did that, but we don't, it's not useful now. It is clearly has some power. So I think it has legitimized that conversation in a way that can be used when we're talking to people about BDS. The other thing I always like to remind people about is that even though, there are endless arguments about whether it'll do anything and blah, 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 the first thing is that when Netanyahu was in power, he said that BDS was an enemy of Israel, second only to Iran. So Netanyahu thought that it was a powerful movement. The other thing is that the Israeli government and allies and friends, both in the US and Israel and in Europe, spend millions and millions and millions and millions of dollars trying to defeat the BDS movement. They actually have now a department of, I think it's called Strategic Affairs, has the word strategic in it, whose sole purpose is to defeat the BDS movement. So if you think that, the 25 states that now make supporting BDS illegal happened accidentally, no, it didn't happen accidentally. There's a huge amount of money and political pressure out there trying to stop the movement, which must mean to me that it has power. And if it has power, we should use it. And we should certainly use this occasion with the horrific things going on in Ukraine to say, look, if it's a strategy there, why can't we discuss it as a strategy elsewhere? So I agree with you.
Susan,
Thank you.
Susan could unmute yourself.
Yeah, hi. Big shout out to both Alice and to First Parish in Bedford for hosting this. And I'm sure there are some Unitarian Universalists here. I am with Unitarian Universalists for Justice in the Middle East, and I just put contact information into the chat. If you're unfamiliar with us, I will get back to you. And I know some of you already are. Thank you.
Thank you, Susan. And let me just scroll down.
There's
here.
a question in the chat. Can I answer that?
Absolutely.
It says, a New Hampshire state rep was recently kicked off the Democratic Party Progressive Caucus for saying from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free. The Democrats and Republicans said it was anti-Semitic. Do you agree? So I don't. And the reason I don't is that, first of all, I'm not 100% sure what from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free means. It could mean we want to have a secular democratic country that goes from the river to the sea. It could mean that we want a federation where people are equal citizens. I have no idea what it means actually. But the point is that criticizing the policies of the state of Israel is different than hating Jews because they're Jews. And one of the things that is very, very hard nowadays is that, Israeli leadership and American Jewish leadership claims that Israel is the state of all the Jews, they represent the Jews. I think that's really a fallacy. If you look at Israel, it is a state, and it has the fabulous things it does and the terrible things it does, just like any other state. And if you look at public opinion, if in terms of American Jewry, the younger generations now, like if you look at people under 40, there's a huge amount of disapproval of Israeli policies. And actually a huge amount of young Jews are disgusted by Israeli policies and actively don't want to have anything to do with Israel or are working against current Israeli policies. So to put those two and say that saying something that potentially is critical of the Israeli government is anti-Semitic, I think is a really erroneous kind of thinking. The big problem is that, for instance, our US State Department has adopted this definition, which was promoted by many people in the powerful Jewish world. And so according to the State Department, saying anything against Israel or saying things that bring doubt to the whatever, can be called anti-Semitic. And I think that's something we need to really push against and really struggle against. And this is a place where having Jewish allies is very useful because I understand if you're not a Jewish person, that the last thing in the world you want to be called is an anti-Semite. It is clearly a horrific thing. I also understand that there is real anti-Semitism. And if you sort of step back the anti-Semitism in this country, which is very, very major and very dangerous, is grounded in the alt-right, in neo-Nazism, in very right-wing politics, and it's part of a politics that hates Jews, hates women, hates Muslims, hates gays. It's a long list of people they hate who are not heterosexual armed white men. That's where the anti-Semitism is coming from in this country, and it is dangerous, and we need to pay attention to it, and we need to work against it. To call criticism of Israel anti-Semitism dilutes the charge and makes it much harder for us to fight real anti-Semitism, because we've diluted it by saying anything that's critical of Israel is anti-Semitism. And there are the first definition of what was called the new anti-Semitism, I think, started in 1974 when the ADL, which used to be a progressive organization fighting bigotry, came out and said that any criticism of Israel is anti-Semitic. And that's not been helping us at all, because there is real anti-Semitism. And also being called a self-hating Jew. But for me, if someone calls me a self-hating Jew, it only has power if I let it have power. I know I'm not a self-hating Jew, so I just ignore it. So you have to have a bit of a tough skin in this game, needless to say.
Thank you. There's Will Thomas had a comment.
That was the comment that
I'm
Alice
sorry.
just read.
Okay.
I'm sorry. Okay. Did anyone else raise a hand that you can see, Paul?
I'm not seeing any hands raised. No.
Okay. I want to thank you, Alice, so much. So much information to try to absorb. And it's clear that there are two sides to every story. And I just wanted to close by saying thank you for everyone for staying on, for listening, opening your hearts and minds to a different perspective. And I wanted to also give a plug to another divestment effort relative to climate change. We're going to have another Lyceum on May 1st about personal values-based investing, also divestment. If you have, and if you want the link to this talk on YouTube, please be sure to send an email to mountainbreeze52@gmail.com. Thank you, everyone. Have a wonderful afternoon.
Thank you. It's a privilege.
Thank
to
you,
have been
Alice.
here.
Bye,
It's a
Alice. Bye,
pleasure.
everybody.
Thank you very much.
So much.